The knowing and the wanting exist in the same interior without resolving each other. That is the specific condition the avoidant is living in during the staying away. Not a condition of peace, not a condition of clarity, not the comfortable stillness of someone who has made a clean decision and is living inside the rightness of it. But the specific, unresolved, daily discomfort of two genuine things pressing against each other without either one winning. The knowing says, I caused damage. The wanting says, I miss them. And neither of those statements cancels the other. Neither provides relief from the other. They simply coexist in the interior, in the silence. In the staying away that is being maintained not because it feels good, but because it feels like the only honest option currently available to someone who has arrived at genuine recognition of what they did without yet arriving at genuine capacity to do differently. This coexistence is exhausting in a way that the active phase of the pattern was not. In the active phase, the defense was operational, the management was running, the fear was producing behavior efficiently, and the behavior was creating distance that the nervous system registered as relief. The interior was uncomfortable, but it had a functional organization. The discomfort was being managed outward, expressed through the withdrawal, given somewhere to go even if that somewhere was the wrong direction. In the staying away that is motivated by genuine accountability, the discomfort has nowhere to go. It cannot be managed outward, because managing it outward would mean either returning, which the recognition of the hurt makes feel inappropriate without demonstrated change, or fully closing, which the genuine wanting makes feel impossible. It sits, internally, without the relief of expression or the relief of resolution. The avoidant in this condition tends to do something that is worth understanding, because it affects the signals the person who was hurt may be receiving from what appears to be total silence. They stay peripherally present, not in the obvious ways, not through direct contact or explicit reaching out, or the clear, unambiguous communication of, I am thinking of you, and I have not moved on, and the silence is not indifference, but in the quieter ways, the ways that can be felt more than seen, the ways that maintain a kind of tenuous, non-demanding, carefully non-intrusive connection to the orbit of the person they are staying away from. They may engage with things that are adjacent to the person without engaging with the person directly. They may be aware, through whatever means their world makes awareness possible, of the broad shape of what the person is doing and how the person appears to be moving through their life without that awareness becoming contact. They may think about reaching out, compose the message in their head, feel the specific pull of the wanting strong enough to bring the words to the surface, and then not send it. Not because the feeling is not real, but because the recognition of the hurt is still louder than the need for the comfort of reaching. This peripheral presence is, in its own limited way, a form of caring, a form of sustained orientation toward the person without the imposition of the avoidance needs onto the person's space. It is the avoidance version of what they can manage, wanting without intruding, caring without demanding, staying in the vicinity of the connection without requiring the connection to accommodate their presence. It is not sufficient, it is not repair, it is not what genuine accountability ultimately requires as its expression, but it is real, and it is different from the indifference it can resemble from the outside, and it is worth knowing the difference between them when the difference exists. The person who was hurt is not obligated to care about this distinction. That needs to be said directly, without softening. The nuance of the avoidance interior condition, the specific texture of the knowing and the wanting, and the accountable staying away, is genuinely interesting and genuinely relevant for understanding what is happening. But understanding what is happening does not create obligation, does not require the person who was hurt to hold space for the avoidance process, to remain in emotional proximity to the silence, while the avoidant works through whatever the staying away is supposed to be working through. To organize any part of their own forward motion around the question of when or whether the avoidance interior movement will produce something adequate. The person who was hurt has their own interior to attend to, their own process of integration, their own reclamation of the self that the dynamic affected, their own genuine forward motion into a life that is not organized around the avoidance availability, or the avoidance growth, or the avoidance eventual decision about what to do with the knowing and the wanting. The understanding of the avoidance interior condition is for the person who was hurt's own clarity, for the accurate reading of what the silence means and what it does not mean, for the prevention of the specific damaging confusion that comes from misreading the silence of genuine accountability as the silence of indifference, the confusion that makes the person question what they experienced, doubt the reality of what was present in the connection, wonder whether the genuine moments were constructed rather than real. They were real. The staying away in this form is evidence of their reality. The avoidant's genuine recognition of what they cost another person does not arise in the absence of genuine connection. It arises precisely because the connection was real enough, and the caring was real enough, and the person was significant enough, that the pattern's impact on them registers as something more than an unfortunate outcome of an incompatible dynamic. It registers as harm caused to someone who mattered. And that registration, that specific self-implicating, uncomfortable accounting of genuine harm caused to someone genuinely cared for, is the thing that the defended, pattern operating avoidant was not capable of in the earlier phases. The defense prevented it. The narrative construction that made the distance sensible, and the incompatibility convenient, and the departure reasonable, kept the genuine reckoning at arm's length, kept the avoidant from having to sit with the full weight of what the behavior produced in someone who did not deserve it. The staying away is what happens when that prevention fails, when the reckoning arrives despite the narrative, when the genuine recognition of harm breaks through the constructed story and presents itself as the thing that actually needs to be lived with. And living with it, genuinely without the usual mechanisms of avoidant management, is new territory for most people in this pattern. It requires the sustained presence with uncomfortable interior content that the avoidant's entire psychological architecture was designed to prevent. It requires sitting with the weight of having hurt someone without the immediate exit of minimization, rationalization, or the redirection of attention towards something more manageable. That sitting is hard. It is not the productive therapeutic kind of hard that moves a person toward genuine change. Not automatically, not without the additional support and intention that converts the uncomfortable sitting into genuine interior work. But it is the beginning of a different relationship with what the pattern costs, not just what it costs the avoidant, but what it costs the people the avoidant loves. The people the avoidant loves. That phrase is not incidental. The avoidant loving the person they hurt is part of what makes this specific staying away different from the ordinary avoidant withdrawal. And it is worth sitting with what love looks like in the avoidance experience, because it does not look the way love typically looks in descriptions of secure, reciprocal, openly expressed attachment, and the difference between those two things has been at the center of the confusion and the pain of this entire dynamic. The avoidant loves through a system that was not designed for love's full expression, that was designed in fact for the containment and management of exactly the kind of genuine, deep state-carrying attachment that love in its real form produces. So the love exists, genuinely, significantly, in ways that the defended behavior consistently underrepresented, within a structure that was built to prevent its full expression, and the result is love that is real and love that is invisible at the surface. Love that is felt intensely in the interior and communicated inadequately or not at all in the behavior. This is the specific tragedy of the avoidance love. Not that it is less than what the other person deserves, but that the system through which it must pass to become behavior consistently reduces it to something less than what it is at the source. The love at the source is real and full and genuine. What arrives at the behavior is managed, rationed, inconsistent, insufficient, and the person on the receiving end of the behavior has no access to the source, can only receive what the behavior delivers, which is never the full thing. The staying away with heart-wrenching is, in a strange and limited sense, the most honest expression of the avoidance love that the system has yet produced in the context of this particular dynamic. Because it is the first behavioral expression that is more organized around the other person's experience than around the avoidant's own comfort. The first instance where what the avoidant chooses to do with the feeling is determined by the recognition of what their previous choices produced, rather than by what would feel most comfortable or most manageable for their own nervous system. That is not a small shift. In the context of a psychology that has been organized around the prioritization of self-protection over genuine other orientation, the staying away that says I will not re-enter your space until I can trust myself to inhabit it differently represents a meaningful, if insufficient, movement in a direction that was previously inaccessible. Meaningful, insufficient, both. And the person who was hurt deserves to hold both of those truths about it, without being pressured, by their own compassion, or by the avoidant's peripheral presence, or by the specific emotional texture of this silence, to weight one more heavily than the other. What happens over time in the avoidant who is staying away in this condition depends on factors that are entirely internal to the avoidant. Factors that the person who was hurt has no control over and no responsibility for. Whether the recognition deepens into genuine motivation for change or gradually loses its acuity as time reduces the immediacy of the loss, whether the staying away becomes the beginning of real interior work or becomes simply the avoidant's new way of managing the pattern's consequences, holding themselves away from the person they hurt as a form of self-punishment that substitutes for the genuine reckoning with what would need to change. Whether the heart that still wants the person eventually inhabits a self that has done enough real work to make that wanting something the person could safely receive, none of those outcomes are determinable from the outside. None of them can be influenced by anything the person who was hurt does or does not do. The trajectory of the avoidant's interior process belongs entirely to the avoidant, to the choices they make about whether to engage with genuine therapeutic work, whether to sustain the recognition past the point where its acuity naturally fades, whether to treat the accountability for the past as motivation for genuine future change, or as a chapter that closes as time creates more distance from the specific pain of it. What the person who was hurt can do, the only thing that genuinely belongs to them in this part of the dynamic, is continue the work of their own reclamation, the work that has nothing to do with the avoidance process and everything to do with their own. The continued, genuine, forward-moving inhabitation of a life that is fully their own. The deepening of the self-knowledge that the dynamic excavated. The integration of the education that the experience provided, about love, about their own patterns, about the specific difference between genuine reciprocity and its compelling simulation, into a self that is larger and clearer and more accurately self-knowing than the self that entered the dynamic. That work is the only thing that is genuinely productive in this phase, not the monitoring of the avoidance silence for signals of what it means. Not the interpretation of the peripheral presence as evidence of imminent return, not the suspension of genuine forward motion in the waiting space of someone else's interior process, the work of the self, continued, regardless. Because the genuine question, the one that matters most for the person who was hurt, in the specific conditions of this specific silence, is not about the avoidant at all. It is not, does the avoidant still want me? The answer to that is yes, in the complicated, suspended, accountable heart still wanting form that has been described throughout this. That answer is available, and it is accurate, and it matters for the clarity of the picture. But the question that matters most, the one that determines what the person who was hurt does with their one, real, genuinely unrepeatable life in the time that the avoidance process takes, is this. What do I want? Not from the avoidant, not in relation to the silence or the staying away or the peripheral presence or the eventual possibility of return if the work gets done, but genuinely from their own life, from the forward movement that the reclamation of themselves made possible, from the connections and the experiences and the genuine inhabitation of their own specific and irreplaceable existence that was always available and was, during the dynamic, partially organized around someone else's availability. What do I want for myself now, in this life that is fully mine, in the days and months and years that belong entirely to me, regardless of what the avoidant does or does not do in their own interior? That question is the most important one available, and it deserves the full, genuine, uncompromised attention of the person asking it. Not the portion of attention that the avoidant silence did not claim. All of it, every bit, turned completely, without residue, toward the life that was always worth that quality of attention. The avoidant knows what they lost. The more important question is whether you know what you have. Because what you have, the self that came through this, the clarity that the dynamic produced, the deepened capacity for genuine love that was never diminished by being given to someone who could not fully receive it, that is not nothing, that is everything. And it belongs, fully and without condition, to you. The everything that belongs to the person who was hurt is not always immediately visible as everything. In the period directly following a dynamic like this, 1. In the specific emotional conditions of the staying away and the silence and the peripheral presence of someone whose heart still wants them, but whose behavior remains the primary available evidence, the everything can feel more like a loss than a fullness. More like the absence of what was hoped for than the presence of what actually remains. This is the grief that does not get enough acknowledgement in conversations about avoidant dynamics. Not the grief of the obvious ending, not the clean break, the decisive departure, the moment that clearly marks the before and the after, but the ambiguous grief. The grief of the unclear ending. The grief of a silence that is not confirmed closure, of a distance that is maintained not through indifference but through complicated caring, of a connection that is neither fully present nor fully resolved. Ambiguous grief is harder to move through than clean grief. Clean grief has a clear object. The person is gone, the relationship is over, the task is the integration of a loss. Ambiguous grief does not have that clarity. It is organized around a situation that has not fully resolved, around someone who is staying away, but whose heart still wants, around a silence that carries interior content that the behavior does not adequately communicate, around the specific uncertainty of not knowing whether what is being grieved is genuinely over or genuinely suspended. That uncertainty has a particular effect on the grief process. It tends to interrupt it, to keep the person who was hurt in a kind of relational limbo, not fully processing the loss because the loss has not been confirmed as final, not fully moving forward because the possibility of the avoidant's genuine return has not been definitively closed, not fully releasing the orientation toward the connection because the connection has not been definitively ended. The limbo is its own form of cost, distinct from the cost of the dynamic itself, adding itself to the accounting of what the avoidance pattern has produced in a phase that was supposed to be the aftermath rather than the continuation of the dynamic's impact. Because the staying away with heart still wanting is, in a functional sense, still the dynamic operating, not in the active form of the push-pull, the withdrawal and the reaching, the warmth and the cooling, but in the quieter, more passive form of the uncertainty that the avoidance interior condition continues to generate in the person who is hurt. The uncertainty about what the silence means. The uncertainty about whether the peripheral presence is intentional communication or incidental coincidence. The uncertainty about whether the genuine recognition of harm that is apparently motivating the staying away will eventually produce genuine change or will gradually fade as the immediacy of the loss reduces. That uncertainty keeps a thread of orientation toward the avoidant alive in the person who was hurt. A thread they may not even be fully aware of, that runs quietly underneath the genuine forward motion of the reclaimed self. That surfaces in the occasional moment of wondering what the avoidant is doing with their interior in the silence, of feeling the specific texture of the staying away and trying to read it for signals about what it is becoming. The thread is not failure, it is not evidence that the reclamation was incomplete, or that the genuine forward motion was performed rather than real. It is simply the natural, human, unavoidable consequence of having loved genuinely and not yet received the clear resolution that would allow the love to find its final resting place, whether that place is the genuine repair of a connection that both people are building differently, or the genuine closure of a connection that both people have honestly acknowledged as complete. What the thread requires is not the deliberate severing that wall building would produce, not the effortful cutting of the orientation through an act of will, or the performance of indifference that does not actually reflect the interior, but the gentle, patient, honest tending of the grief, the allowing of the ambiguous loss to be processed as what it actually is, without the imposition of premature clarity in either direction. Not forcing the conclusion that it is definitely over, not maintaining the hope that it will definitely resolve into something different, but sitting, with as much genuine equanimity as the emotional reality of the moment allows, in the actual condition of not knowing, of genuinely not having the information that would resolve the ambiguity, of living in the uncertainty with as much integrity and as much genuine self-referencing as is possible, while the avoidance interior process continues on its own timeline, in its own conditions, producing whatever it is going to produce without the person who was hurt being able to determine or accelerate or control the outcome. Living in genuine uncertainty is one of the most demanding things available to a human being in an intimate relational context, because the mind's response to uncertainty is not equanimity, not naturally, not without significant and sustained practice. The mind's natural response to uncertainty is the generation of narrative, the construction of the story that makes the uncertainty manageable by resolving it, however artificially, into something that can be known and responded to. The narrative might go in the direction of certainty about loss. They are never coming back. The staying away is permanent. The heart that still wants is not sufficient to produce the change that genuine return would require. The most self-protective reading of the silence is the most accurate one. That narrative provides the clarity that allows the grief to proceed as clean grief, to have a definitive object, to be processed as a confirmed ending rather than an ambiguous suspension. Or the narrative might go in the direction of certainty about return. They are staying away because they are working on themselves. The heart that still wants will eventually produce the behavior that the wanting deserves to produce. The staying away is temporary, and the return, when it comes, will be genuine rather than pattern repetitive. That narrative provides the hope that makes the uncertainty bearable by replacing it with anticipated resolution. Both narratives are understandable. Both are the mind doing what the mind does when genuine uncertainty is too uncomfortable to sustain without the relief of a story. And both carry their own specific costs. The narrative of certain loss cuts the grief work short by resolving the ambiguity before it has actually resolved. It allows the processing to proceed, but it proceeds in relation to a conclusion that has been artificially imposed rather than genuinely arrived at. And when the actual outcome eventually reveals itself, whether as genuine return or genuine permanent ending, the person who is operating inside the premature narrative has to do additional work to integrate the discrepancy between the story they were living in and the reality that arrived. The narrative of certain return is more immediately costly. It keeps the person who was hurt in the specific ongoing hope-animated suspension that the avoidant dynamic was already producing during its active phase, organized around the avoidance potential rather than their own genuine life, waiting for the external resolution rather than inhabiting the full present of their own ongoing existence. It converts the ambiguous grief into anticipatory hope, which feels better than grief in the short term and costs considerably more in the long term if the hoped-for return does not materialize or materializes in a form that does not justify the sustained anticipation. The alternative to both narratives is not easily arrived at. It is not a comfortable position or a natural one. It requires something that most people have to practice rather than simply inhabit. The alternative is genuine, patient, non-narrative presence in the actual condition, which is, the avoidant is staying away because they know they hurt you, their heart still wants you, and you do not know what those two things are going to produce over time, and you cannot know. And the not knowing is the actual situation you are in, and it deserves to be met as the actual situation rather than as a temporary condition to be resolved as quickly as possible, through the imposition of a story that provides premature relief at the cost of accuracy. That meeting, the honest, clear-eyed, neither hoping nor closing meeting of genuine uncertainty, is the hardest position to hold. And it is also the most honest one, the one that, when the clarity eventually arrives in whatever form the actual outcome produces, allows the person who was hurt to receive that clarity without the additional work of dismantling a premature narrative they had been living inside. There is something else that deserves to be named about this phase, about the specific experience of the person who was hurt in the period of the staying away. Something that exists alongside the grief and the uncertainty and the ambiguous quality of a loss that has not been confirmed as final. It is the experience of being thought about, of being carried in someone's interior even in the absence of contact, of being the subject of genuine recognition and genuine wanting, in a space that the behavior does not access, but that is nonetheless real. This is a strange experience. It does not provide comfort in the obvious sense, does not fill the space that the person's absence created, does not substitute for the genuine, present, reciprocal connection that was always what the dynamic was trying to become. But it has a quality that is not entirely without its own kind of meaning. To be known by someone, to have been genuinely seen, to have made the specific kind of impression that produces genuine recognition of harm caused and genuine suspended wanting, is not the same as being loved adequately. The person who was hurt deserves adequate love, deserves the full, present, consistently expressed, behaviorally demonstrated version of the care that the avoidance interior genuinely holds. But being known is not nothing. Being the specific person whose significance was real enough to produce genuine accountability in someone whose pattern had never produced genuine accountability before. That is not nothing. It is not sufficient. But it is real, and it is specific to who the person who was hurt actually is, and it deserves to be received as the real thing it is, rather than dismissed as meaningless because it arrived in insufficient form. The avoidance heart still wanting is the evidence of what the connection actually was. Not what it was at the surface, not what the behavior communicated, not what the managed, defended, fear-operated expression of the feeling conveyed to the person receiving it, but what it actually was at the level of genuine feeling, genuine impact, genuine recognition of another person's specific and irreplaceable quality. The connection was real. That is what the heart still wanting confirms. It was real in the avoidance interior in ways the behavior consistently failed to reflect. And the person who was hurt, who may have spent significant time in the confusion of the dynamic, wondering whether the realness they felt was genuine or constructed, whether the depth they perceived was actually present or a projection of their own hoping, can receive the staying away with heart still wanting as the confirmation of the question they were always most uncertain about. It was real. The avoidant felt it, feels it still. The staying away is motivated by the recognition of the real connection and the real harm done to the real person who was genuinely significant. It does not arise in the absence of genuine feeling. It arises because the feeling was always present, is still present, and is now accompanied by an accountability that the feeling's earlier expressions were never accompanied by. Knowing it was real changes something, not immediately, not in a way that resolves the grief or eliminates the uncertainty, or answers the question of what comes next, but in the specific, interior, self-referencing way of something that was questioned and has now been answered. The reality of the connection was never in doubt from the person's side. They felt it, lived in it, extended themselves into it, with the full investment of someone who was certain of what they were experiencing. The doubt was always about the other side, about whether what they felt was mutual or whether it was the compelling one-sided experience of someone who was investing more genuinely than they were receiving. The staying away with heart still wanting answers that, not with the answer that would have been preferred, not the presence, not the genuine showing up, not the adequate expression of the mutual reality in the form of consistent, reciprocal, genuinely present connection, but with the truth, the uncomfortable, insufficient, genuinely meaningful truth that the feeling was always real on both sides, even when only one side was expressing it adequately. That truth sits in the person who was hurt with a particular quality, not as comfort exactly, not as grief exactly, as something more specific than either of those. As the strange, bittersweet, accurate recognition of having loved something real that could not, in the conditions that were available, become what it deserved to be. Not because the love was wrong, not because the connection was mistaken, but because the conditions, the specific interior conditions of the avoidant who carried the feeling without the capacity to express it adequately, were not sufficient for the real thing to flourish in the form it deserved. The seed was real, the soil was insufficient, and what grows from real seeds in insufficient soil is not a reflection on the quality of the seed. It is a reflection on the soil. And soil, the interior soil of a person's psychological capacity for genuine intimacy, can change, can be worked and tended and developed into something more capable of holding what grows in it than it was in the season when the growing was attempted. Whether the avoidance soil changes, whether the staying away becomes the fallow period before genuine cultivation, or simply the extended absence of someone who wanted but did not choose to do the work that genuine wanting eventually requires, is the question that time will answer. Not the person who was hurt, not the quality of their love, not the depth of their understanding, not the patience of their waiting, or the clarity of their standards, or any other variable they could theoretically adjust to influence the outcome. Time, and the avoidant's own choosing. Those are the only two things that will answer it. And in the meantime, in the actual, real, genuinely happening present of the person who was hurt, the life continues, not in suspension, not organized around the question of what the avoidant's interior is becoming, but genuinely forward in the full inhabitation of the days that belong to the person who was hurt, regardless of what the avoidant does with their own. The grief is real and it is being processed. The uncertainty is real and it is being sat with. Honestly, the ambiguous loss is real and it is being met with as much genuine equanimity as the emotional reality allows. And underneath all of that, underneath the grief and the uncertainty and the strange bittersweet recognition of a real connection that could not become what it deserved, the self continues. The reclaimed, integrated, forward-moving, genuinely alive self that the dynamic could not diminish and the staying away cannot suspend. That self has things to do, people to love, genuine connections to build, with people who show up in the ordinary conditions, who do not require the interpretation of silence for signals of caring, who do not communicate love most clearly in its absence. The avoidant's heart still wants. And the person who was hurt has a heart too, one that deserves, finally and completely, to be wanted in ways that actually reach them. Not in the silence, not in the staying away, in the genuine, present, daily, chosen, unglamorous and extraordinary reality of someone who shows up. And keeps showing up, because they chose to, not because they were afraid to leave.